Welcome to In All Things. Here at Loyola University Chicago, we call ourselves a diverse community seeking God in all things. Join us for a series of thought-provoking and engaging conversations with ramblers across many areas of expertise. We hope you can join us in a process of discovery and inspiration as we all expand our perspectives. I'd now like to introduce our host, our Vice President for Mission Integration, Claire Noonan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome again to In All Things. I am delighted to introduce you to today's guest, Dr. Michelle Nickerson. Dr. Nickerson is professor of history at Loyola University Chicago, where she teaches courses on the history of women and gender, U.S. politics, and urban America. She's also a Fulbright Fellow and serves the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum on its Committee of Scholars. Dr. Nickerson has 3 books of history, the most recent of which was published just earlier this year by the University of Chicago Press. It is entitled Spiritual Criminals: How the Camden 28 Put the Vietnam War on Trial. The book examines the relationship between Catholicism and radicalism in the peace movement of the Vietnam War era in the United States. Michelle, I am so pleased to welcome you to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And I've been actually reading Spiritual Criminals and with a lot of interest, and have been excited to have the opportunity to talk to you more about it. And I want to say, by way of informing our listeners a little bit more about your background, that you've done a lot of important work looking at the political spectrum from a historical perspective, including groups of Catholic activists on the kind of radical left, as this book is, but also you have an earlier book about conservative women of the Sun Belt. So it's very interesting time to be talking to you when your expertise spans that great spectrum. So maybe for our listeners who don't already know, can you tell us a little bit of the story? Who were the Camden 28?
So the Camden 28 were a group of defendants in a trial. That's how they got the title Camden 28. They were all on trial together in 1973 because they had burglarized a draft board in 1971 in Camden, New Jersey. They did that in opposition to the Vietnam War. They were part of a movement called Catholic Resistance, or the Catholic Left. And these were groups of radical Catholics who, between 1967 and about 1973, actually broke into draft boards in order to destroy or steal the records of men who were classified as 1A, meaning ready to be drafted to serve in Vietnam. And so the Camden 28 were apprehended because they had an FBI mole among them, an informant. That's how law enforcement officials were able to get 28 people in this particular arrest. And I decided to write about them because it is an unbelievable story. From the story of this particular group, the story of the movement, the story of the political action, the break-in, the story of their community, the story of the trial, it really gripped me. And then, yes, it gave me the opportunity to do historical analysis of American politics and religion and the intersection between the two, and to really dive into an actual relationship between Catholicism and political radicalism, which does not get much attention in American history.
So can you say a bit about how your research about this group of people and, as you say, the larger movement to which they were connected has complicated your own, or offers your readers a more complicated story of faith and perhaps the relationship of faith to politics?
Sure. So I grabbed onto this story at a particular moment in my life. I was raised Catholic in suburban New Jersey, probably 15 miles from all of this activity. And I grew up without any familiarity with the Camden 28 or with this movement at all. And to my horror, I can tell you I didn't know about it through college, through graduate school, even when I started as a professor. And so I was really surprised and actually very excited to learn that all of these things were happening, and that there was a story of Catholics who would do this work on behalf of peace, that they would be so moved to take these incredible risks, and that there was an expansive story of faith, of theology, of Catholic social teaching that went along with it. And in that respect, it was just a real wonderful learning opportunity for me. And this came along with my reentry into the church. In my 30s, I just became more interested in developing my own spiritual life. I was starting my family, and I was thinking about the world I wanted to raise my child and in what faith tradition. And so to have this story to tell basically as my job as a researcher, as I was learning more about Catholicism in a way that really nurtured me personally, as someone who likes to dig deep into texts, right? The scholar that I am, I relished the opportunity to read encyclicals, pastoral letters, and books about the church, and to work with other people who had these areas of expertise, and to dive into projects on Catholic social teaching with colleagues at Loyola. It was really just a wonderful invitation to explore, both in terms of faith and in terms of my own personal curiosity.
I love that expansiveness that you speak about, Michelle, and it reminds me of, our title at this podcast is In All Things, and it comes from that phrase in our university mission statement, a diverse community seeking God in all things. Can you say a little bit more about your pursuit of the story of these individual people and what it opened up for you in terms of exploring God's work in all things? As you say, it sounds like you began maybe an interdisciplinary or intertextual exploration through this project that maybe you hadn't anticipated.
Yes. So when I first embarked on this story, I saw it as a Catholic movement, and I imagined myself reading the things that these political subjects read and wondering, okay, which authors animated you, Cookie, and you, Bob Good, and who were your heroes in the church, that kind of thing. And so I'll never forget then interviewing Cookie Rodolphe, a really important activist in this movement who features often in the book. And she looks at me with curiosity. By the way, at that point in time, she was a law professor still at Santa Clara. And so I flew out to California. I was hosted by the university so that I could interview Professor Cookie Rodolphe. And she just looked at me curiously. She said, I wasn't really reading anything. She said, I was just, I saw Vietnam on television. I saw what it was doing. I saw, also she grew up in South Philadelphia, and she witnessed many of her neighbors going off to fight and coming back in coffins. And so for her, it wasn't the least bit intellectual or theological. In fact, her participation in the Catholic left, paradoxically, came along with her exit from the church. And this was the story of many people on the Catholic left, in the sense that there are two generations in the movement. And so I'm talking about the younger generation. They tended to be college age, and they committed themselves full time to fighting the war. So almost all of them dropped out of college for a time, and they felt their relationship with the institutional church to be very challenged. And so they were questioning the extent to which they needed to remain part of their church community, even as they were drawn to priests and nuns and former missionaries who were leading this movement. And so talk about complicated. There's really no easy or simple story about how God invited them to do this activism in any way that I found easy to pin down or comprehend. And so to hear all of their personal stories, and then to follow it after the movement as well, took me a long time to really sort. I had the great privilege of interviewing many of them and other people associated with the movement. And it turns out many of them came back to Catholicism, or many of them joined other, mostly Christian faith traditions. Some of them sort of remained on the periphery of Catholicism. Some continue to identify as Catholic, even though they attend a different church in a different denomination. And in this way, for me personally, this really did enrich my understanding of my own faith and what it really means to develop and think about a relationship with God and try to understand the way that God moves through people and the choices they make and the relationships that they have. It causes me to think about the relationship between faith in action and faith in institutions and faith in hierarchies, where I do think that it's worth paying attention to those institutions, but also paying attention to the many different ways that people associate themselves. So meaning when someone is Catholic or imagines themselves and sees their own relationship to God in terms of their Catholicism and those traditions, it's very likely to be extremely different from the person sitting next to them in a pew.
Our identities and our faith gets worked out quite differently in the context of other influences that are shaping our lives.
And when you hear surveys and polls by, let's say, the Pew Center or some other institution that they're released and tell you what percentage of Americans believe in God, to me, I can't help but just wonder how can anybody imagine that one person to the next means the same thing when they answer that question. And I know when I think about that, it's probably very different from someone in my own parish, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yes. And this raises up another question I wanted to ask you,
Sure.
Michelle, about the story of the Camden 28 also has some significant connections to the Jesuits.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been wondering if there is a way, perhaps similar to what you've just described as your understanding of the way people relate to a church or to their idea of who God is, if this research has also influenced your thinking about what it means to teach at a Jesuit university.
Sure. So let me talk a little bit about the Jesuits in the book. So this story really unfolds on the political landscape of post-World War II America. And one of the most important developments in the context of this is Vatican II. So, the council is meeting over the early 1960s, and the church is reforming in important ways. And in the Society of Jesus, like all religious orders, priests are being called upon to think about their charism and to go back to their roots. And so for many Jesuits, and in particular Jesuits in the United States, this is where you see a new or a renewed discussion about faith in action and justice. And so it is no surprise that there are many Jesuits involved in the Catholic left, in Catholic resistance, because many were called, and they called each other, to put themselves, their bodies, on the line in pursuit of justice, in pursuit of peace. And they were not the only priests, but they, I would say, played a particular role as leaders in this movement because they were so incredibly educated, and many of them had ties to the Catholic worker movement, which is a movement dating back to the 1930s that embraced Catholic social teaching as a way to serve the dispossessed. And so since many Jesuit priests had been in conversation, if not with Dorothy Day and Peter Martin in person, they were very familiar with their teachings. They were in conversation with Thomas Merton and all of these important thinkers and writers who were clarifying I would say, a late 20th century vision of what it meant to be Christian and Catholic, and to walk in the footsteps of Jesus and to live by the Gospels. And so Jesuits were really entrenched in a great deal of history and philosophy because of their education. And they were, for lack of a better word, a very powerful fraternity in that they were connected to each other. And the Catholic left was a movement of people who were connected through friendships and people who had been students together, people at the Woodstock Seminary where many of the Jesuits were trained. And these became environments of politicization. And so to witness how many of them embraced peace, even when it marginalized them from the larger church, I found to be so interesting and pretty inspiring. To think that many of them were disciplined for doing this work. Daniel Berrigan was sent to South America for a time because of something he wrote or said. And, he was a very important Jesuit, one of the people to really launch this movement. I mean, he'd been essentially exiled. And to witness their persistence and their willingness to take these risks has made it, I would say, all the more interesting to participate in the kind of pedagogy that the Society of Jesus developed over the course of centuries, and to think about its relationship to faith in action and understanding of Catholic social teaching. And I also, it helps me trust their respect for academic freedom and freedom of thought, that it animates my own teaching in the classroom.
One of the tactics that you talk about the Camden 28 employing which I thought was really interesting and connects to this characterization that you just gave about putting yourself on the line for peace, for what gospel justice that you feel called to, was you call it a hit and stay model of war resistance, which I think you mean you do your action, in this case, destroying the draft cards, and then you stay and wait to be apprehended by law enforcement.
Right.
Versus a different model where you hit and flee, I think you call it.
Hit and split is
hit
what they
and
call
split.
it.
There
Yes.
you go. How very 1960s. And I wonder if you can talk about the relationship between a spirituality that is connected to the gospel.
So the movement started as hit and stay. When the first draft board raid happened in 1967, it was 4 men, and they entered the Baltimore Customs House. They brought a reporter along with them to document the whole thing. So they very self-consciously brought a witness in to watch and record and report what they were doing. And they pushed past the staff of the draft board, and they broke into the filing cabinets and they poured blood. And it was very important that people reading the newspaper saw that they were performing not just a symbolic act of exposing the violence of the war and bringing attention to the men who were being exploited by the draft system, but to make this a sacramental act. They were anointing those files. This was an act of devotion. And for them, it was also an act of penance in the sense that they volunteered to be arrested. And going to jail was part of the penance that they were doing. They were receiving the consequences for what the government was doing in this larger project of escalating violence in Vietnam. And so they and then subsequent raiders spent quite a bit of time behind bars. And they did this quite willingly. But then what happens is this initial generation of raiders, and as I mentioned in the book, these really were priests, nuns, and former missionaries for the most part, and devout lay Catholics. They're all in jail after a while, or most of them are. And those who weren't are going around and giving talks about the resistance on college campuses. And this is then animating a younger generation of mostly students affiliated with college, Catholic universities or seminaries, and they have a different relationship to the movement. Also, they're younger, and the idea of spending so much time behind bars it's just different for them. These are not people who made vows, for example, and they don't have the same relationship maybe to martyrdom. And also, it was practical in the sense that by doing hit and split actions in the middle of the night, then they could do more raids. And that's exactly what happened. You had people who would do multiple raids. But then there were still plenty of people who remained committed to hit and stay. And so let me give you an example. Philip Berrigan, brother of Daniel Berrigan, was one of those initial raiders. Over the course of his life, I think he spent maybe 17 years behind bars. And so this model of submitting yourself to arrest and going to jail, that never really did stop. I mean, it continues into the Plowshares movement against nuclearization. The American media pays far less attention to these radicals than they did in the Vietnam War era, but the radicalism never stopped. And so there continue to be people who are doing these sacramental acts and showing devotion in this particular way for all of us, even though no one's paying a whole lot of attention.
What a powerful story. Michelle, I cannot believe we are already out of time. So before we depart, I want to ask you, and with this paradoxical portrait that you've just paid of these Catholic radicals from this period, but also many of whom are still living and who are still active, I wonder if you could offer your own reflection on this question. Howard Gray, who is a now deceased Jesuit, great spiritual teacher, once said that the great Ignatian insight is to call people toward to become fully alive. Is there a way in which your study of this Camden 28 has brought forth fullness of life for you?
I would say that in writing this story, I have had the opportunity to see people who are fully alive and how people do this, how they, in seeking God and in seeking to do God's work, they find abundant life and joy. I would say I continue to struggle with the challenge of doing that in my own life. The hardest thing about writing a book about the Camden 28 is knowing that I couldn't do what they did. I don't know how they were able to risk so much. And there were other people in this movement who had children, multiple children, and they did this. And so trying to understand and think about what I could do for peace is very hard and ongoing. But I consider it one of the most important benefits of a job like mine is that I can, even if it's just telling this story, which to me is a beautiful story. Now, you know from reading this book that there are people who made a lot of mistakes. These are human, fallible people who hurt other people. They were in relationships where they hurt each other. But at the same time, I was able to witness how even for this moment, this brief moment, there was a beloved community that came together and were able to accomplish something pretty spectacular that none of them would forget, and everyone who witnessed them at that time would never forget. And I hope that by writing the story the way I did, that other readers will be able to encounter them as well.
What a beautiful way to end, Michelle. Aren't we all flawed? Don't we all hope and also hurt each other? And still we ask, what is it that we can do for peace? Thank you so much, Michelle. What an honor to have had this time with you. As a reminder, Dr. Nickerson's new book is called Spiritual Criminals: How the Camden 28 Put the Vietnam War on Trial, and it's available for purchase now. You can find more episodes of this podcast, In All Things, on Spotify, YouTube, and on the Loyola University Chicago website by searching for Ignatian Heritage Month. I want to thank the whole team at In All Things: Kayla Cooney, Clemisha Richards, Lauren Schwer, Julia Price. Thank you again, Michelle.
Thank you, Claire.
And until next time, keep seeking God in all things.